Hi, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm counting down my top 10 episodes of Colombo. I've loved Colombo ever since I was a child. It's probably my favourite US TV series. I don't usually like detective series actually, but Colombo really does it for me. And I think for certain reasons. One is Peter Falk, one of my favourite actors. I find him an absolutely fascinating actor to watch. It keeps reminding me of what Orson Welles said, and I've said this in other videos. Wells said there's no such thing as overacting. That's a misconception. There is only acting without truth. So you know that whole thing, the player king in Hamlet gives all that advice to those actors putting on the play within the play, saying don't move your arms about and don't overstress things and all that. Peter Falk does all of that. You know, think about it. He goes, "Sir, one more thing," and all this business. It's a completely unnaturalistic performance, right? But you believe every single second of it. That's what Wells meant. You can't overact, really. What you've got to get is the truth of the scenario and the right energy. And that's what Peter Falk gets almost every single time. It's a brilliant, sustained performance, and that's why he won so many Emmys for it. I also think it's a terrific character, right? You know, Colombo is this crappy, sloppy, badly dressed guy who, he drives a crappy car. He has a crappy dog. He's always going on about his wife and his nephews. He's a bumbling, slightly irritating man, but he's the smartest man in the room. And he's totally driven, and he's always going to get his man. And I think that is a brilliant characterization. I think Falk pulls it off to perfection. And what I like about Colombo is that for all his charm, he always calls people sir or ma'am. He's always polite to them. He is absolutely and utterly focused. And I like the idea that there's nothing else in his life. There is only getting the murderer. And so I agree with Falk that we should never see Mrs. Colombo, that we should never see the home life. In a lot of other detective dramas, we're always going back and seeing, their friends and what they do at home, and if they're a bit depressed about this, like Morse is always depressed about something. In Colombo, they just get rid of all that. They just clear the decks. He's just a guy investigating a crime, and that's all he cares about. And I like the idea that there is nothing else in Colombo's life, that he probably lives in this crappy flat with no decorations on the wall, and all he cares about is capturing the murderer. You see, I like that idea, the theory, that there is no Mrs. Colombo at all. Falk didn't like this. He said there is, but we should never see her. I like the idea that it's all made up, that it's just a ruse to get his opponents, the killers, talking to him. Anyway, there we go. The other thing that I like about Colombo is it's not a typical detective series, right? The way it starts is it starts with the murder, and you see how the murderer commits it and all the strategies they're going to use to get away with it. And then about quarter of an hour in, Colombo comes in, and you're watching him solve it and piece it together. And so, whodunits I don't really like them. I find them a bit of a bore, to be honest. You go through them interviewing various people and going down various dead ends and red herrings, and then eventually you have this big scene at the end where you're told, and did you get it right or didn't you get it right? I find that dull and tedious. Colombo gets rid of all that. It wipes the slate, says, look, this is the murder, this is how it was done, and this is the murderer. And so what you're doing is you're watching this duel, this combat between Colombo and the murderer. And I really like that because it brings the acting and the drama and the tension centre stage. Instead of some little crossword puzzle over who's done it, you get the actors coming forward, and it's the battle between them. And the best Colombo episodes are those where Falk and another actor are really well matched, where the other actor is playing a really interesting character and they're a really good actor who can work with Falk and ad-lib and improvise with him. And that's when you get the really good Colombo episodes, I think. And I also like the other ancillary characters and Colombo's interaction with them. I've noticed, looking at top tens online of Colombo, a lot of people like to think of Colombo more as a comic character than a dramatic character. I'm not like that. I think Colombo is a dramatic character, a very serious character, who can be funny. But once Colombo tries to accentuate the comedy, I think it's actually not as interesting. And that's part of the reason why I only like the 70s episodes. The 45 episodes made in the 1970s, including the two pilots. The later Colombo, which came back in 89 and went through the early 90s, I don't like at all. And partly it's because I think Peter Falk's performance is not as sharp, and it's more of a comic buffoon performance rather than this kind of quite serious character who's digging for the truth. The other reason I don't like the 90s stuff as much is because I like the 70s. I'm a huge fan of the 70s, and I like 70s America. I like the cars and the clothes, the way people talked, the look of the buildings. I like the Americanness of Colombo, particularly the 70s Americanness. That's my thing. Anyway, enough. Let's get on to the top 10. So at number 10 is A Friend Indeed. This is the final episode of the third season. And it's a really interesting episode, directed by Ben Gazzara, very well directed, starring Richard Kiley. And he plays Colombo's own police commissioner. And his friend calls him up. His friend has accidentally killed his wife. And Richard Kiley sees a chance. He blackmails his friend into helping him kill his wife. And they come up with this very convoluted scheme. So it pitches Colombo against his own police commissioner. And it's a brilliant episode. The denouement, the way Colombo catches the killer, is one of the best in the whole series. And Richard Kiley is very effective as this kind of really quite nasty piece of work, and the support performances are excellent. There's some great business with this, this kind of lifelong burglar and how he helps out Colombo in the end. And he's got some great scenes in the snooker hall with his kind of his wife, who's always fed up with him going off on jobs and burgling houses. It's great fun and a very, very strong episode, I think. At number 9 is The Most Dangerous Match. Now this, I've noticed in other people's top 10 Colombos, this doesn't feature very highly. It's always been one of my favourite episodes. And it stars Lawrence Harvey, a very strange, brittle English actor, as this Dudek. He's this chess master who's coming up against this person who he thinks he's never going to beat. So he decides to kill him. And this has been one of my favourite Colombos for the longest time. The way that Colombo is going to catch him is signalled very early on, because Dudek has a hearing aid, he's hard of hearing, and that's going to come into it somewhere. But the episode is just so well written and directed, and Harvey is so wonderfully intense in the part against Colombo. He's a perfect foil for Colombo's bumbling charm. I really like that episode very much. And number 8 is the very first episode that was ever syndicated. It was actually the second ever filmed, but it was the first to ever go out. And it just happened to be directed by Steven Spielberg. Very young Steven Spielberg, cutting his teeth. And though you can't tell it's directed by Spielberg, but you can tell it's directed by a really, really good director. The atmosphere, the pacing, the acting is superb. It's the first episode to feature who would become arguably the best enemy for Colombo, right there in the first episode. Jack Cassidy, an actor I wasn't very familiar with. Apparently he was more of a song and dance man in his youth, but he's very oily. He's got these kind of clear, piercing blue eyes, and he's a very sort of oily person, and he's very smartly dressed and unctuous, and he's a real shit, he's really horrible. He's very, very good in this story about this publisher who decides to bump off this writer he's been working with for years. It's true that the ending is a bit of an anticlimax, but I also, although in terms of plot it's a bit of an anticlimax, in terms of the thematics of the villain, it's really, really good. And a favourite episode of mine. And I really love the woman who plays the blackmailer in it. She's very funny. Number 7 is the second episode that went out, but the first to be filmed, which also introduced one of the great enemies for Peter Falk, which was Robert Culp, who also, like Jack Cassidy, appears 3 times in the series. And each one of his episodes is terrific, as is the Jack Cassidy episodes. They're all good. This one is called Death Lends a Hand. And to me, this is almost like the perfect Colombo episode. It's got a really interesting relationship between the murderer and the victim. The murderer he heads a private detective agency, and he tries to blackmail the wife of a local politician into giving him information which will help out his business, and she doesn't go along with it, and he kills her. And then what happens after he kills her is brilliantly directed, right? He slaps her across the face in a moment of anger. She falls down on the thing, and then you zoom into his glasses, and you see in split screen in his glasses him, tidying up afterwards and tidying up all the evidence. It's terrific. Then you find out that she's married to Ray Milland. So Ray Milland just happens to be a guest character, one of my favourite actors. And, the duel between him and Falk begins. But there's some wonderful ancillary characters as well. There's a wonderful scene with this golf pro who's been having an affair with this woman. And the scene where Falk confronts him, he says, come on, let's go and have some golf lessons outside. Come on. Yeah, come on, let's do it. And he's having this golf lesson. He's pretending not to be very good at golf because he's brilliant at it, like everything. And the way he cuts down this man's story is brilliantly done. It's a brilliant piece of acting. It's a great episode. It's not often well remembered amongst Colombo fans, but I think it's perfect. And the denouement and everything in Harry's court, the acting, the pacing, the duel between the two men is perfect, really. At number 6, Double Exposure. This is a Marmite episode, I understand, amongst Colombo fans. For me, I love it. I could dive into a vat of that Marmite. This is the one where Robert Culp, again, he comes back and he's an advertising guy. He's an advertising guru, finding out ways of getting people to do things. And he's putting on this film for some execs, and he slips in a subliminal clip, which was a big, exciting thing in the 70s, of a glass of water, and this guy goes out to drink, and when he goes out to drink, he shoots him. It's a very fast-paced episode, probably one of the shortest Colombo episodes, and it's very pure. It's just Falk versus Culp all the way through. There's very little fat on it. But the idea is absolutely brilliant. I love the subliminal clip idea, and I love the way that idea is turned against the villain at the end. And Culp is sublime in this episode. He's absolutely wonderful. And I love the scene, again, around golf, weirdly enough. The scene where, Colombo goes to disturb him on the golf course, and at the end of the scene, Colombo says, for a minute there, I thought I'd ruined your game. And Culp says, not a chance. It's just a great little bit of dialogue. And I love the way that those two interact. It's one of my absolute favourites. And I also love the guy who plays the projectionist who tries to blackmail Culp. He's a very good actor. 5th place is Swan Song. Now, this could have been the gimmick episode of Colombo. It's the one with Johnny Cash. And Johnny Cash gets to perform a song at the beginning, and he performs songs throughout. And you think, oh, okay, this is the gimmick episode. Actually, it turns out to be one of the best episodes of Colombo. It's so rich and full. The murder is very well thought out, using this plane. And Johnny Cash's character is an old parachutist. So what he decides to do is drug his passengers and then jump out the plane and leave them to die. And the way it's thought through is brilliant. So Colombo meets this plane investigator, air crash investigator, who's just like him, who's just as obsessive as he is. And he becomes an interesting secondary character. But Johnny Cash proves to be a very good actor. And he's got a kind of natural grace and gravitas about him. And he's quite easygoing. And he's got a good line and humour. And there's a wonderful scene between him and Falk discussing their old army days, where you feel the truth of Johnny Cash and Peter Falk leaking through into their characters. They also stuff it full of lots of comedy scenes. Peter Falk had this favourite actor of his, who was an Italian actor, who often plays little comic vignettes in his episodes. And he's very good as this undertaker who's trying to sell Colombo this insurance plan. Watch out for that, it's very funny. But it's a really good episode, actually. It's surprisingly good. And Ida Lupino just happens to be one of the guest stars. 4th place is Make Me a Perfect Murder. This is the best episode of the last 2 years of Colombo, when it was starting to fade a little bit. But this is a really great episode. It stars Trish Van Devere, who was George C. Scott's wife, trivia fans. She plays this TV executive who is passed over and in a sort of fit of feminist pride kills her lover who was in charge of this decision. And it's quite an interesting episode because it's more of a film than other episodes of Colombo, because it's more interested in the murderer and what she's going through. It's quite a feminist episode exploring how a woman who's trying to be executive in a man's universe is coping with the prejudice and fighting back, really. And Falk almost becomes one of those men, this kind of irritating detective who's on her tail. And more than in any other episode, you're kind of on the side of the murderer. And Trish Van Devere is really, really good as the murderer. I've noticed online a lot of people don't like this episode because it goes off. It starts to digress from the murder to look at Trish Van Devers' life. But I quite like that. I mean, it makes it more rich. It gives the episode a bit more volume. There's a bit more character to it. So you watch her as she tries to help her friend, who's a TV star who's on drugs, and it builds up her character a bit more. I think it's a really solid, really interesting episode, an attempt to do something a bit different with the formula, and I really like it very much. Third, Publish or Perish. We're back to Jack Cassidy again, my favourite Colombo villain. This is from the brilliant third season, which is probably the best season of Colombo. And what I like about this is one where he's a publisher who wants to kill his favourite writer because his favourite writer's gone off to some other publisher. And he uses this wacko who is interested in bomb making and he's trying to write this book about how to produce the best bombs. And he uses him to kill this guy. And this is such a rich episode. It's so well directed. It uses sort of 70s split screen. So you're watching him create his alibi while the wacko bomb guy is killing the guy. On the other part of the screen, you're watching the murderer, concrete his alibi by getting really drunk in bars and backing into old people's cars and stuff. And Jack Cassidy is superb throughout. He's very slimy and oily and horrible. And there's wonderful ancillary characters. The guy who makes the bombs is great fun. It features Mariette Hartley, beautiful Mariette Hartley, who looks lovely in a red cowboy hat. In a great scene where, Colombo goes, he's always interviewing rich people, isn't he? He's always bringing down the rich. And he goes into this wealthy restaurant and he's interviewing them in this wealthy restaurant and he orders a bowl of chili. It's a great little scene, and there's a wonderful bit of ad-lib from Peter Falk at the end when he's getting up from the table. He says, can't seem to get up. It's very funny, watch out for it, it's very well acted. And this episode is full of those moments. Again, a great denouement, a great come down of the villain. The direction, the pacing, the dialogue, everything is so perfect in this episode. The top two episodes are something really special, I think. At number 2 is By Dawn's Early Light. This is the first episode to feature Patrick McGoohan, who would become a regular in the series and would also direct some episodes. Later on, Patrick McGoohan would become a bit indulgent, as he was wont to do in his performances. But in this performance, he's absolutely pin sharp. And he plays the head of a military academy for boys. And the person who actually owns it is a real heel, as the Americans say. And he wants to sort of basically stop this military academy from functioning. He wants to turn it into a co-ed school. And Patrick McGoohan, sees all these years of tradition and honour falling away. And he kills him. And he kills him in a very interesting way. They're having this open day and they fire a gun. And he packs the gun with explosives so the gun explodes and kills this guy. It starts brilliantly with this wonderful travelling shot down a corridor in complete silence. And I loved this as a kid, I loved the simplicity of the titles of Colombo. Peter Falk is Colombo. Guest starring Patrick McGoohan. All in complete silence as you're going down this corridor. Then you go into this kitchen and there's this man sweating as he quietly unscrews a bomb and then adds plastic explosive to it. It's all done I love the pacing of it. It's very slow, it takes its time, not like modern television. And it's really tense and beautiful and quiet. And the whole episode, you could have thought it was a gimmick episode, right? Because at one point, Colombo decides to stay in the academy and be around the boys, and he has to get up in the morning when they have to do the reveille and all that sort of stuff. But actually, the whole thing is it's really intelligently directed and really respectfully directed. And I love the truth of the interactions between Colombo and the boys. There's a very funny scene when he's telling this story to this guy in the washroom about him giving a young girl a friendship bracelet when they were teenagers at school. And years later he found she still had the same bracelet. And Falk goes, well, I was impressed. And all the stuff about the cider and the ceiling. I love this episode so much. Patrick McGoohan makes it. It's a beautiful performance. And I think he got an Emmy for it. And he deserved it. Great stuff. But there is another episode that even beat that one. I had to pick this one. I had to pick it. It is A Stitch in Crime. That's right, it's the Dr. Spot one. Leonard Nimoy playing an evil surgeon. I love this episode so much. Who would have thought that Leonard Nimoy, of all people, would be the perfect Colombo villain? He is so suave and urbane, and he's such a bastard. In this episode, he has a brilliant idea that what he's going to do, he's going to sew up this doctor who he works with after a bypass operation, but he's going to sew him up with a different kind of suture that will dissolve. So eventually this guy will die, right? He'll have some kind of seizure, and no one will suspect that it was a murder. But unfortunately, Leonard Nimoy is caught out by his nurse, very well played by Anne Francis, and he kills her. The acting of the subsidiary cast in this episode is terrific. The guy playing the doctor who he's going to kill is very good. Also, the junkie who Leonard Nimoy tries to incriminate is really well played, and I love the first scene between him and Colombo. And the whole episode is just, it's got a terrific sense of dread. There's a terrific conflict between Leonard Nimoy and Peter Falk. I love the scene when Peter Falk turns up to Leonard Nimoy's house and he's having a big party, and Peter Falk eats too much food. It's beautifully acted and very funny. But I think this has got to be my favourite. There are many great Colombo episodes, but I always go back to the Leonard Nimoy, evil surgeon episode. Well, that's my top 10, but you know what? Colombo is fantastic. It's such a great series. I mean, I ranked them, and I think you could go down to episode 30, 31, 32 out of 45, and you've still got really good episodes. There were 6, actually, that I particularly wanted to include in this top 10. I'll just briefly list them. There's the third Jack Cassidy episode where he's a magician who just happens to be a Nazi. That's great. There's the one with Robert Vaughan on the cruise ship. That's really good, with Patrick Macnee wearing little socks as the captain. There's the one with Vera Miles when she's the head of a cosmetics company, which apparently is not very popular amongst Colombo fans. You're joking. It's got Vera Miles, Vincent Price and Martin Sheen in the same episode. It's brilliantly characterised. It's very funny. Can't understand why that episode isn't popular. There's a very good episode in the first season called Lady in Waiting, which features an actress called Susan Clark. She's a sort of ditzy heiress of this family. Very good performance by her, and her boyfriend is played by Leslie Nielsen. It's a really good little cameo. If you watch that episode, watch out for the scene where Colombo takes Leslie Nielsen to a diner, and there's a brilliant bit of business by Leslie Nielsen sort of off camera where he's looking at the burger and seeing how shit it is. It's very funny. The Donald Pleasance episode. I'm really sorry to Colombo fans. I know that is often voted the best episode, and it is brilliant. And Donald Pleasance is out of the stratosphere in that part. He's so good in that part. I didn't include it in my top 10, and I feel really bad about it because it is a great episode. And also the Dick Van Dyke episode. Who'd have thought he'd be a great villain for Colombo, but he really is. That's a really good episode as well. And I could mention loads of others. I love Colombo. I could talk about it all day. But let me know your favourites down below. Is there any that I missed that you really like? And tell me how much you love Colombo too. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.